Hello everyone, I'm Zahid from Talks at Innovation Valley and really warm welcome all of you to the podcast show. Today we have a very special guest, Rebecka Zavaleta, co-founder of Pesmo. And Rebecca, really warm welcome to the show.
बहुत शुक्रिया. Thanks, Zahid. Thanks for having me on the show and looking forward to our conversation.
Before I jump to the questions, I would little bit tell you more about Rebecca. She is really an amazing entrepreneur. In fact, I could say that she is a kind of global entrepreneur, traveling a lot and around the world and bringing a lot of perspectives and experiences and exposures to the industry and to the startup ecosystem of Pakistan, especially. She has been and she in Pakistan many times, and she is working with the Pakistani startup ecosystem very well. And I think that she knows a lot about Pakistani startup ecosystem. So that is the reason, actually, when I was studying about Radhika, so the topic that came to my mind was actually startup mechanics. So that is the reason I put the topic startup mechanics, and Radhika would be telling to the potential entrepreneurs and startup founders about the startup mechanics, that what actually startup means, how you as a university student or as a potential entrepreneur or as a startup founder build your perfect startup, a perfect company, a perfect product, how the things goes. So Rebecca, my first question from you, not in fact the question, I would love you to introduce yourself a little bit about your story. I mean, from where you are, about your education, why you decided to come to the startup domain, what inspired you actually.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for that beautiful introduction, Zahid. So I'm originally from Los Angeles, California. I grew up between LA and Mexico. So I guess you could say my background has been more of like switching between a developing market and a developed market. And so in my childhood, I often went between seeing a lot of poverty, crossing like the border towns of Tijuana and going to LA, a world that is that obviously has a lot of money. And over the years, I've always been very motivated to be able to create products that helps sort of address these sort of structural issues we have in inequality. And so I have created products over the years, sort of testing and messing around with it. And I will say that while I was in college, so I went to University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, I was very, very passionate about working for the United Nations, the United Nations Development Program specifically. I wanted to work in politics, but I felt that in order to really make change, and after seeing like the explosion of like Facebook, MySpace, and the effect that it has like on the world globally, what Facebook has how it has affected places like India, Pakistan, I genuinely felt that it was through tech that I felt I could do a bigger impact. And so when I was out of college, you don't really have a lot of money, and I felt that I needed to learn how to build a startup without money. So how do you do that? So I started working for a lot of small startups. And I'm talking about being one of the first employees. And what I've learned in these startups is that there is no perfect product, there is no perfect startup. The perfection does not exist in startups. I think it's been over 10 years that I've been in this space, across six different startups in advertising technology and finance technology, fintech, adtech, mostly in California. I've learned that uh, the key to startup mechanics is building a innovation sort of process where it's not only run by the founders, the co-founders, but also the team itself, where they're constantly pushing test and learn strategies. Because even if a sales process works a specific way, it won't always work like that. I mean, like look at Facebook, look at Instagram, look at TikTok. They're constantly innovating because there's always new players entering the market. So I really think that true the most successful startups is always a reflection of mentality, and that mentality is just embracing change and constantly innovating and learning.
All right. So, Rebecca, can you please tell us a little bit more about your own startup, Pesmo, the background?
Yeah.
What was the initial idea? Why you started Pesmo?
Okay. That's a great question. So Pesmo today is a HR tech slash fintech company. We're a global company. We have a presence in Ethiopia, in Mexico, in the US, and in Pakistan. And what we do is we provide HR, payroll, and benefit solutions. We focus mostly on the use cases in emerging markets, which means in Mexico, we're trying to understand, how can we improve the payroll process? How can we improve the access to benefits? Because, for example, in the US, I was able to buy my first home via a connection through my payroll provider, where I was able to get an affordable loan to buy my first home. So I think like being able to have access to these products helps people get on the wealth ladder and start climbing it. And right now, in Pakistan, it is very difficult for an average person to build wealth. In Mexico, it's also the same thing. So it's more of just creating access to opportunities, and we think we can truly provide that via Pesmo, as well as making it a people enablement tool where not only are you having getting access to specific benefits, but you're also able to sort of focus on your career. How can you grow? How can you get access to better sort of strategies on leveling up your career? So this is kind of like the long-term vision that we have for Pesmo.
Right. Rebecca, how you started your startup? I mean, what were the first steps that you took to take your startup off the ground, and how you secured your initial funds? I mean, did you raise the fund or did you bootstrap? And what would you like to give some of the strategies and tips to the new startup founders or the university students how they can start actually?
Yeah. Um, I think this is a great question. So, like I said, my first break into startups has always been working in other startups where I was always one of the first 10 employees. And what that has allowed me to do is kind of understand like what are the biggest pitfalls in startups. And what I mostly find is that one, people have a hard time selling it because selling the product because they're afraid to pick up the phone and jump on a call with a customer. And two, people don't know how to build tech. So if you're going to build a tech company, you really need to know how to build tech simply because things in tech can often take 3 times as long, cost 3 times as much, and be 3 times as difficult. My background in being able to work in tech for so long has enabled me to understand like how can we reach momentum faster, how can we build a sales funnel, how can we implement like processes and growth hacking. So as I was working in these startups over the last 10 years, I started accumulating my own wealth because I knew that I was going to build my own startup, and I knew that in order to get there, I would have to bootstrap it. So I used basically the first funds were my own funds where I bootstrapped it. And once you're able to build the product, because I wanted to build something big, not like a simple small MVP, but more a holistic product. And so once that was built, I had my existing network of people who I worked with before who know I can build product, who know I can build successful products and actually sell them into the market. I worked with them, and via their recommendations and their connections, it just kept going on and on and on. And I was able to close some funding for the company. But it's not just that, but it's also just making sure that you can start monetizing as soon as possible. So these are the recommendations I have. I would also add that even if you don't have a network, uh, people on LinkedIn, random strangers are often very, very, very keen on being able to help out entrepreneurs, minority entrepreneurs, female entrepreneurs. So if you have an idea and you want to get started, definitely reach out to people, do some cold calls, do some cold emails, and you never know where it's going to take you, because if you can't sell yourself, then you won't be able to sell your startup. So it's always a good muscle to.
If a university student or if anybody, a potential entrepreneur, wants to start a startup, what should be his or her motivation or inspiration to initiate a startup? For example, if it is problem solving, the problem is people actually don't know how to identify the problem and how to then
Yeah.
solve it. So what tips would you give to our potential entrepreneurs, how they could identify the problem, how they could do the market research, and how then they could build the solution, build the product? What are the What is the checklist?
Yeah, so this is actually a very good point that you brought up. I have been invited to give some talks here and there, and one thing that I've always found very interesting is people want to be entrepreneurs, people want to build products, except people, one, don't know how to do it. But I would say that before the know part, it's more of like not having enough confidence to being able to actually build the product. And I will say this. Um, there could always be a million Facebooks, right? I genuinely believe that some mature markets are becoming more fragmented in terms of the product offerings that they provide. So the way that you might do Uber might be a bit different. There's InDrive, there's Uber, there's Lyft, right? There's Kareem. There's so many different product variations that at the end of the day, they provide the same product. But maybe each product does it a different way. Maybe one is more focused towards women's safety, one is more focused towards like a health sort of niche, right? So what really matters to me, in my opinion, is again this going back to this notion of like building this innovation machine. It's how you ask questions, and I always go back to this because I think Elon Musk is a great example of how we ask ourselves questions. In one of his biographical books, he mentions that one of the greatest key indicators for success is how you ask the next questions. And so there are some frameworks to it. Some of them is called like the 5 whys. Like you have to ask yourself the question and you keep asking yourself that question in a different way until you get to like the crux of it. And let's say you want to solve I guess food problems in Pakistan. Then it's trying to understand like why is this issue happening, and then once you understand why this issue is happening, then it's trying to understand the mechanics of why those mechanics are even happening in the beginning. So as long as you're constantly asking yourself the why and constantly pivoting, I think that anyone can be successful in what they build as long as they keep it in a very um, like constrained sort of manner in how they are deploying that product, if that makes sense.
Right. Rebecca, when we talk on the product building, there is a problem actually. Sometimes there are non-tech, especially when we talk about the tech founders who are with the non-tech background. So they think until they learn coding, they cannot be a startup founder. Until they learn programming, they cannot build a product. What would you say on this part? Second, is it really necessary that since day one, a startup founder must have a very cool product with an AI engineering and so what would you say on this?
Right. So I think the first question is, do you need a technical background in order to build product? I think one, it depends on what you're building. If you're trying to build ChatGPT, well then yeah, you kind of have to understand the mechanics of how an AI-based product would work. If you're trying to build a rocket, then yes, you will have to understand the mechanics of how this works. So you kind of need like that background. It depends what it is. So either you're really, really good at understanding the mechanics. And when I say the mechanics, I mean like the unit flow of how something works. Like, for example, like when you use your credit card, how does it go from releasing funds to buying funds to getting a refund to making sure that all of the KYC details are fulfilled properly? So either you know the mechanics of what needs to be done, or you understand from a technical point of view on how to build it the fastest, quickest way. Because I have seen so many startups spend 3 times money in these errors of like building technical products the wrong way, in the sense that you have to scrap it all up and throw it away and rebuild it from scratch. And there's nothing more frustrating than that. So I think to answer that first question, it depends what you're building, and then I would respond with I from my experience don't think you do need that much of a technical background as long as you do understand the mechanics of it very well. Now, granted, if you don't have that technical background, I do recommend having tech leads or a co-founder who does have a strong technical background, because otherwise you will start missing deadlines, you'll start having bugs that you didn't expect. So it really depends on what you're building. Like for most e-commerce products, I don't think you would need a technical background to get there. And I forgot the second.
Really necessary that when a startup founder starts to build a product, it should be very cool, it should be very AI based, and you know
Got it.
that.
Yes.
Why it can't be just a
Uh,
simple WordPress?
right. No, a lot of principles in startups is always just get it out the door as soon as possible, right? I have been with startups that have taken about 1 year in getting out the product simply because they want to make it perfect. They want to make it right. And I understand this because it's like your little baby and you want to make sure that it goes out into the market properly. But I come from more the view of like if it's 80% there, then it's 80% good enough for users to start using it and start testing it. I just think that it matters on which type of users you sort of roll the product out with. You need to have champion users, you need to have pilot users, users that know that the product is buggy, users that know that there is a roadmap to the product and that there will be a period for the product to mature. So it honestly is like you're learning how to cook biryani, right? Your first biryani isn't going to be perfect, but the point is that you're mixing in the ingredients, the rice, the saffron. You're trying to figure out like what works for you. So I think it's just getting started, getting it out the door, and being able to test it with customers, even if it's just in the prototype sort of phase. You'll learn that maybe they're understanding the way a specific flow differently than you thought it would be work. So never work in like your own head, and often just going out with a customer and just trying to understand like how to best build this product.
Rebecca, many times this happens that startup founders don't find the co-founders.
Hmm.
So is it okay to be a solo founder? If yes, how is it possible? How to be a good solo founder? What are the challenges?
Um, I think if you're building like a e-commerce company, I think you can definitely build it by yourself. I think if you're building a media company, you can build it by yourself. But I think when it comes to much more difficult uh, business products, such as like a very complicated tech product, where you might have a lot of issues and like the bugs or architectural issues that kind of like start splitting you in different directions, I think it is very important to have a co-founder. And there are many points in the journey where it's a sense of accountability, right? Either it's like if you're a solo founder, you either have yourself to keep yourself accountable, or your mom or your best friends, but it really is a point of accountability, and it really is also just kind of like your other half and making sure, or other halves if you have more than one co-founder, and making sure you're building the right thing the right way, because maybe sometimes they have a eureka moment and they inspire you to sort of take things a different direction. I will say that my co-founder is often making me think things very differently, and I enjoy that sort of like out of the box push. And I push my team a lot to constantly question ourselves, constantly think outside the box. If they think if things start getting normalized, if things start getting standardized, then let's figure out how we can break the process and find a different way to like innovate our process even further.
Right. You know, Rebecca, most of the startup founders, they are unable to raise the funds. One. The second, most of the startup founders, they have limited or minimum resources. So one thing is, to approach the customers, to acquire the users. So what are some of the strategies would you like to give to the audience, how they could acquire the initial customers with minimum or no budget?
Hmm. So your question is, if I'm starting out and I don't have a budget, I am struggling to get a budget to begin with, how can I sort of build that sort of fund in order to build the product, right? And like as you said, customers are your first customers are the best people to come after, in the sense that maybe it's just an idea and maybe you see a specific issue with them. If you sort of write down the idea on paper, on a whiteboard, walk them through it, and you can say something like, hey, if you spare 5,000, 10,000 out of your budget, then I can build you this solution. And most of the time, the solution looks more like a manual process that that they're outsourcing for you to manage. And that sort of manual process is a piece that you start automating with the funds and the money you start getting from your customers. So that's definitely one way to do it. Another way to get started is obviously from angel investors, from your close friends and family. And I know in many communities, asking money from family and friends is just something you wouldn't do. You can even post it like online to strangers to see like who would be interested in like providing $1,000, $2,000 to help sort of build this idea. I think most products can be built within like $30,000 or less, depending on what the product is. You know, you can go on Upwork, you can go on Fiverr, you can message people on LinkedIn, or you can make them a co-founder. The idea ultimately is just to get it out the door. Otherwise, it would just end up being an idea.
All right. So, team is a very important element when we talk on the startup. So, since you have minimum resources, how could you, build a very, very small team? Initially, how could you manage the getting things done with the minimum resources? For example, maybe it's freelancers, project based working, or I mean, how?
Okay, so I think what you're asking is how can you sort of build things with like a small team? Um, so this starts with having this big idea, and within this big idea you start thinking, and I use this example a lot. For example, it could be a food app like Uber Eats or Food Panda. You think about what are the three big pieces that you need to build out first. Like, yes, there's a checkout experience, there's a delivery experience, but maybe the first version of the product is more of just like it's an app where you open it and it shows you like all your favorite food places, you look at the menu. Maybe like that's kind of like the flow initially. Then you'll build out the delivery, the checkout experience later on. So once you have like the core use cases built out, then you can work with like your small engineering team. Maybe it'll take you 3 months to build it, 6 months to build it. And since I do follow the agile methodology that first originated in Japan, when the car makers in Japan were being able to push out cars faster than the American industry. Um, you start having maybe a Kanban sort of methodology or a Scrum methodology where there's always a set amount of tickets that we're going after for that week, and we tackle them as a team. And you have to figure out who's best at what. Maybe one specific engineer is best at the back end, and one is more with the back end APIs, and one is more with the front end. So you sort of break out those tickets, um, and you divide it, you set accountability, and every week, as long as you're progressing forward even just a little bit, you will get more and more towards creating that product that you need in order to get customers using it for the first version to start getting feedback.
Right. What are the key metrics that a startup founder should consider, and he or she must have that key metrics on his or her table that would be telling him or her that his startup is growing, the customers are happy.
That's a great question. Some of the key metrics that I often focus on, the number one key metric that I'm always stressing out about is having a North Star metric. So a North Star metric could just be maybe a specific formula that people follow. Uh, and this needs to be like across your company. All the departments must be able to follow this sort of specific key formula. Like, for example, for Airbnb, this sort of key metric is number of nights booked, right? So whatever the marketing department is trying to do, as long as they're going after the metric, number of nights booked, then you can assume more or less that they're aligned with the engineering department, the sales department. And I'm stressing out on this because in startups, also another thing that I have seen is that different departments will go for different metrics, and sometimes they compete with each other, and they start fighting for the same resources. But you're one business, you're one company, so it's good for everyone to stay behind like the same metric. And Um, to answer your next question, what are the other metrics that really matter? It depends on what sort of product you're building, right? And the default frameworks that I always fall for is the AAR model, which is um, acquisition, activation, and retention. So whatever features you build, you have to make sure that they fall within those buckets. And some of those features are kind of like the onboarding flow. How easy is it for a user to get into your product? Then there's the activation piece where it's like, what defines a active user in your product? Do they have to like for example on Instagram, do they have to post a photo? Does that make them an active user? I mean, we've all heard of all of these ghost accounts, all of these bots, and Instagram can say I have millions of users, but if they're just users who just create accounts and do nothing, is that actually a user? And the third piece is the retention piece. What makes a user come back to the product? And when you start thinking within these three different pipelines, that's when it helps you easier to prioritize. Okay, I think we're good on the retention part. Now let's just make it easier for users to onboard. So this allows you to like plug and play and figure out how to move forward with your overall vision.
As a founder and CEO of the company, you are the driver of the company. How, and there are multiple teams in a company. How a startup founder or CEO of a company can keep his or her team really engaged, really happy, really motivated, and how a CEO can collaborate and communicate clearly and with all the departments. It's really a challenging job, actually.
I think that is a great question. Um, so I think I have a bit of a different perspective on this simply because after being across so many startups, having friends in startups, and watching startups grow and fail, I do think that an idea is just an idea is as strong as the team behind it, right? So I don't think Instagram is as successful as it is solely because of the co-founders. I do think it's the team behind Instagram that helped build the product, or the team behind WhatsApp, for example. The reason why I say this is because the founders are kind of like the starting DNA for the company. They're the ones who are setting the deadlines. They're the ones who are creating the visions, the goals. But everyone else that they hire, everyone else who is a part of that team is 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 as important in the sense that they are managing those specific departments. So it becomes kind of like an octopus, right? A startup becomes like an octopus, like that has many different hands, right? And these sort of hands all need to work together in order to get you moving into one direction. So um, I do think that everyone that is hired is very, very important. And I don't think that it is solely because of a co founder that a business is successful. And to just create this sort of space of growing an awesome team. So this is like the cultural DNA, right? Are the co-founders innovative focus? Are the co-founders, do they have more of like a sales experience? Do they have more of a product experience? Do they have more of a technical experience? So just based on the co-founder or founder DNA, that gives me a sense of like how that startup is going to think, right? If it's a sales focused startup, then I know that the number one goal would be just hitting the numbers versus and trying to please as many customers as possible versus making sure that we're building a streamlined sort of product. And I say this just based off of experience and working with many different startups. And I will say that from the startups I've worked with or consulted with, one key thing that does make them very successful is having constant all hands, constant sort of like realms of like transparency. That's when everyone's just on the same page as much as possible, and that's what enables better communication. I want everyone on my team to be able to feel that they can tell me anything.
Something is called mental consensus, and one thing is called harmony. As a founder and CEO, sometimes it's really challenging to bring your team on one thing. For example, as a CEO, you want something change in the startup, in the company, or in the product. But you have to convince your engineering team on that. You have to convince your marketing team on that. It's really challenging. How, as a founder, you could make mental consensus and convince your team and bring all the team on the single point.
I actually like the questions that you're asking, Zahid. So thanks for thinking of them. This is very important because I think that most people believe that a CEO has an idea and they simply demand it to happen, or they ask for it to happen and all of a sudden it happens. But I don't, but I have seen teams grow, and the most successful teams don't grow just because they're forced to do something. I think that one, they need to believe in that vision. They need to believe in that idea. So a CEO needs to work on getting buy-in, right? So I need to make sure that my department, my engineering team agrees to being able to do this a specific way. They need to get the product side, the marketing side. Otherwise, there is no harmony without this sort of stage of buy-in. The second piece that I want to add is uh, these are the stages of like team building. It's called storming, forming, and norming. I think when one person understands that there is a phase of complete chaos, then they are more able to go through that storm, that a storm of chaos. You know, the best way to get through a sandstorm is through it, right? So then when you're adopting things like digitization, for example, when Adobe decided to create a SaaS model, there is this storming piece that happens first where everyone's unhappy, everyone's trying to figure out how is this going to work. And then on the forming side, you start seeing more like standardization, more agreement between the different parties. And then on the norming side, you have reached that specific area that you've been sort of like pushing for your company to get into, and now it becomes the new normal. So I always find these phases in a company to be very interesting.
Right. You know, Rebecca, from the outside, people think startup is a very crazy and cool thing. The founders and the teams are enjoying. But you know what? When the things are going on in the company, suddenly what happens, one thing is called conflict. There was a project going on, but suddenly what happened is people, they have conflicts, teams have conflict with each other. That conflict might be on the approach and method with which they are trying to solve a problem. One is saying, hey, it should be do like this, one is saying, hey, it should be do like this. So when it comes to the conflict management, how as a founder and CEO you ensure that all the team is working in a harmony with a cooperation approach, not with vice versa, to avoid the conflicts.
Oh, I don't think conflicts can never be avoided simply because and one mentor told me this, and I found it to be very, very true over the years, is that, you know, the hardest part of building a business is always people. It's not getting money, it's not the tech, it's people, getting people to work together. And what I have found interesting over the years is that you want conflict, you want this sort of discord to happen, you want people to, the more conflict, it depends like how the conflict emanates, you want people to really push their opinions really hard, you want them to be passionate, because that is what allows you to create such a great product. But the part that is difficult is when this conflict happens and you don't know why. And by why, I mean you don't know the real reason why this conflict is happening, the crux of it. You know, maybe a specific head of engineering hates the way that marketing is doing a certain thing simply because of another reason, but they'll never let you know that reason. And it's that lack of transparency that really hurts a business sometimes. So and I try to create processes where when you're working with teams of 20, with 30, with 50, I try to sort of like push us back to our why. Why are we building this? What are our reasons behind this? Like, what are our goals together as a team? Kind of just reminding everyone that, we're behind the same team to begin with. And then sort of working one-on-one with the main points of where this conflict is coming from, and then pushing through that. And yeah, I mean, people are complex. I mean, just look at our world. We can't get behind proper climate change sort of actions. We can't get behind a lot of things. It's who we are. This problem is never going to go away.
Right. You know, when we talk on the team, when we talk on the, every startup founder, every company has a certain vision and mission. They have certain goals and milestones. They have certain strategies and plans. So when it comes to structuring a company, when it comes to structuring the processes of a company, how, as a CEO, you ensure that everything is aligned with the central mission and vision of the company, whatever people are doing, either it's, the financial operations or engineering operations or business operations, everything is aligned with the central vision and mission of the company and with the central strategy of the company, and people are not going, directionless with their own wish list.
Right. So this is what I mean by successful startups do well simply because co-founders have strong visions, and in those strong visions, they know exactly what needs to happen out of specific teams or sort of specific initiatives, right? They know what they need from their product, sales, engineering, marketing department, right? And this is kind of like, I don't know if you guys have seen Spider-Man, but there's this piece where he's holding the webs on all the buildings and he's just trying to like pull everything together. That's literally the role of a CEO, of a co-founder, consistently every single day. And then when you notice a specific department going off into different direction, you pull them back in immediately, because sometimes when it goes too far, then it just takes that much more energy to reel them back in. So I think that that is a practice that a true leader needs to be pushing consistently. You have to bang the idea of, what is the vision every single day, and you need to be able to call on someone randomly on your team and ask them, well, why do we exist? Why are we building this? If they can't answer it, then you're probably not doing as good of a job as you think you are.
Right now there are millions of tech products in the world, and many times people think everything has been invented. Now what can I
Yeah.
do actually? So is this just an illusion of fear, or every day is a new day and every day has a problem that you can solve? Your say on this.
Yeah. I think I sort of alluded to it a bit earlier in our conversation, where I don't think, uh, okay, maybe you can say all the great names have been taken, or everything great has been built already, right? But as I said, in more mature markets, like in the US, what you're starting to see is some fragmentation, right? When you go on YouTube and you want to see a specific sort of category, you'll notice that there's millions of subcategories for it. So same thing with like fintech, right? Maybe it's like a budgeting app that teaches you how to budget better, right? But maybe it's a generalized way of telling you how to budget. But and then there's this new app that tells you how to budget from a Gen Z point of view, from a Gen X point of view, from a boomer point of view. I think based on our unique perspectives, or like for example, mine is like Mexican American, grew up between a developed world and a developing world, you can always add your own branding, your own sort of twist on because you start focusing a lot more on the use cases, very specific use cases that haven't been addressed yet, right? There's Lyft, there's Uber, there's InDrive, there's like Kareem, there's so many different iterations of one thing, even for food apps. So I do think if you genuinely can build a product that your audience, your loyal audience would love, then I think you should build it, because it will always come from your own very unique perspective of building things.
Right. According to a lot of reports available worldwide globally, more than 90% startups just fail. What are the key reasons why startups fail, and how a startup founder or startup team can avoid those key reasons?
Yeah. So I think that startups fail simply because they no longer fell in love with, they fell out of love of the idea of building a product for their customer. I think as long as you're building something for your customer, you will find results. You will find champion users. And as long as you're highlighting this to your investors, to your other customers, then you'll sort of start reaching that sort of traction. I have been part of the experience of like if you build it, they will come. And I have always learned that they never come. So it's not just about building the product, but marketing it in a way, selling it in a way that your core user understands how to use it, how to onboard, and how to understand what the use cases are. Is it intuitive enough for them? All of these things matter. And you are constantly solving for these things when you are having everyday conversations with your customers, because your customer will tell you, I couldn't log in because I didn't know how to log in, or I mean, I love the product but I just found it too expensive. If you keep having these conversations, you will get there. So I genuinely believe that startups fail because they forgot who their customer is, or they no longer fell in love with answering solving for their customers problems.
All right. So I will have just a couple of more questions, and um, many people think to start a startup, but they never do. What are the main mental barriers, and how they can just avoid those barriers and just jump into this?
Mhm. I think when it comes to very large ideas, sometimes they become so big that we fall into like this no starter problem where I'm going to climb that mountain and that's my goal, but I actually will spend the rest of my life never climbing that mountain. But if I start breaking up that sort of mountain to climb, as in like, okay, I'm going to push myself to run for 30 minutes every single day so that I can at least get from point A of the mountain to point B. And I think when you start breaking your mountain up into chunks and just starts focusing on that specific chunk, I think you will start being into that sort of traction of climbing the mountain before you know it. And so if you have a big idea, and you have an issue getting started with it, would recommend sort of breaking it down into smaller pieces, or even not working on the idea at all for a bit, and just to prove to yourself that you can do something, that you can have an idea and go after it. Maybe it's as simple as like selling candy bars, simple as like selling e-commerce, or a specific product that you want to see, can I really monetize products A, and then taking yourself to that bigger vision. So I think if the focus is always small and with direction, you can get there.
How a startup founder knows that my startup or my company is ready to scale, and is it really necessary that a startup needs to scale up even if it is not needed? How to decide about it?
Yeah, so the art of scaling, I think, depends a lot on like what your goals are. Maybe one business doesn't want to be a big startup. Maybe they just want to solve a specific problem and they want to monetize and they make money, right? That's better than a startup that blew up to I guess like $500 million in valuation, but never really created a good product. So it really depends on the vision that someone has. But I would say that one way that you know that you need to scale is when you have reached bandwidth. And by that I mean like, is your sales team being overwhelmed? Is your marketing team being overwhelmed? Are you getting so many leads that you're the only way you can solve the problem is through via more overhead, meaning you have to hire more people to solve for problems? So it really just depends on what the underlying vision is long term.
Rebecca, It was really insightful talking to you. My last question, in fact, not the last question actually. Uh, what would you like to give a one core message to the potential entrepreneurs, startup founders, and university students? Any message that could make them inspired, that could make their eyes brighter, and they could, get out of their bed and take the action.
Hmm. So my answer is based off of just actually meeting some university students and seeing this no starter problem, and my answer to that is, I think if you find a really good friend that you trust emotionally, mentally, and in all these specific areas of what stops you from building something bigger, if you work with that friend to actually build something, and maybe it's not your startup, maybe it's something small, maybe it's like selling like eid products, right? Or and then validating to yourself that you can get started, that you can do it, that you can have one idea and sort of see it to the end. I think once you get past that validating to yourself phase, I think then you start sort of figuring out, oh, what more can I do? Should I open up a YouTube channel? Should I like contact this person? It's more of a like proving to yourself that you can do it. And when you do it with friends, with close family, that's how you get there faster.
Rebecca, thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for such a great and insightful conversation. And I'm sure that all of the audience of Talks at Innovation Valley will learn a lot out of your conversation.
Zahid, thanks for having Innovation Valley, for constantly pushing out of your comfort zone, meeting people from different companies, getting them to reply to you. You're an amazing hustler, and thank you for the insightful questions that you've asked me here today.